Captain Bugson, commanding officer, 1st Battalion of the 2nd Nassau Regiment. The farm was in the shape of a long, closed rectangle. The building made up 3 of the sides, and the 4th, on the left, was made up partly by the garden wall and partly by other buildings. This rectangle was divided in 2 internally by living accommodation and a wall. The upper part contained not just the big house, but also various farm buildings. The lower part contained the stalls and barns. Each section had one large gate, the upper facing towards the enemy positions, the lower towards their opponents. Joining the farm to the left was a vegetable garden, with a wall 5 to 6 feet high along its front, and left and a hedge to its rear. The front wall ran into a wood and was masked by an incomplete hedge planted a few paces ahead. Left of the garden was an orchard. The vegetable garden and orchard were not joined, but the latter had a hedge along its front, running along the same line as the wall of the garden. The buildings and the vegetable garden were covered against the enemy by a wood to the south. Jérôme. At 12:15, I received the order to begin the attack. I marched on the wood, and I occupied the majority after a lively resistance, killing and losing many men. At 2 p.m, I was the master of the entire wood, and the battle was engaged along the whole front line. But the enemy, who realised the importance of this point, rushed forward a reserve and took it from me. I advanced with my whole division, and at 3 p.m, after a bloody fight, I took it again, and from then held it to the end of the battle. Private Clay, of the 3rd Guards. We remained in a kneeling position under this cover, but annoyed by a most galling fire from the opponent's guns to the left of our position, so near to us, indeed that the spreading of their small shots rarely escaped contact with our knapsacks and accoutrements. Even the heels of our shoes, whilst kneeling, were struck by them. Lieutenant Ponticoulon, an experienced artillery officer. The attack on the chateau of Hougoumont, behind the walls of which were entrenched the best shots of the English army, should have been an affair of artillery, rather than a badly directed infantry battle that killed our bravest soldiers without profit. This episode of the great battle would then have lasted half an hour, instead of dragging on for several hours. And a commanding officer of the French unit involved in the attack wrote, "I deployed the rest of my battalion to the left of the 69th that formed the left of the 5th Division. A fold in the ground hid this battalion from the view of the English, and also my battalion. A sunken lane which cut through this fold seemed to serve as a shelter for our 2nd Battalion, but in establishing itself there, it made a small kink in the line, and our General of Brigade, Baudin, ordered the 2nd Battalion to establish itself in front of the sunken lane. This put it in view of the enemy. Hardly had the 1st Division got into position than the English batteries, established in front of their line, opened a lively fire which knocked over 20 men of the 2nd Battalion, and more balls followed so rapidly that it was obliged to drop back down into the shelter of the lane. This cannon fire seemed to give the signal for the principal action, and fire opened along the whole line. Chef de Battalion Levasseur. A terrible fusillade was heard to our left, in the small wood in front of Prince Jérôme. The Marshal sent me to reconnoitre. I passed the Prince at a gallop, whose division was still deployed in mass in the valley. Despite the balls that whistled past my ears, I approached the wood that held our infantry. I found all the fantassins posted behind the tree, begging for support. Their colonel asked me with authority to have some troops sent to disengage him. Jérôme had sent only 2 regiments to take this wood that was held by 6,000 men. These 2 regiments had crossed the open ground and had reached as far as the wood, but were not able to go further because the enemy was shooting them down. I returned as quickly as possible, close to Prince Jérôme, and told him heatedly that the wood could only be taken by force using the whole of his division, and that by only sending 2 regiments he had got them massacred. Colonel Joliet. At the extent of the wood there was a house that the English had fortified. Several times our skirmishers, despite the order that limited them to prevent the enemy from manoeuvring against our left, wanted to seize this house that was in their way. Each time they were repulsed and retired to our side of the wood. I tried hard to support them and put them back in their place, for I'd been warned that we were to become the pivot of the army, and consequently it was vital to maintain our position at all costs. I thus passed part of the day, regularly having men wounded by English balls or howitzer shells. Whilst I was sitting at the bottom of an embankment, at the edge of the wood, I heard something rolling behind me. I turned around and saw a shell that was coming down the slope on my right. I had time to lie flat, and it exploded without doing me the least harm. Colonel Petier. Colonel Cubier formed an advanced guard and gave it to Sous-Lieutenant Bonnet to command, an old soldier of the army of Spain, who had been made an officer by Marshal Suchet for being first into the breach at Tarragone. This detachment turned the farm building, broke open the cart gate, entered the courtyard. The first Legier marched behind them. Bonnet struck with mighty blows to the side open at this entry, threw it down, penetrated into the courtyard, where he and his men were shot down at point-blank range from an elevated platform. All found death there. Joliet, about Colonel Cubier. His arm in a sling, at the attack on Hougoumont, he displayed such courage that the English officers, seeing him fall from his horse after receiving a new wound, threw themselves in front of their soldiers to prevent them from killing him. They picked him up and by their care and attention showed him their admiration. Lieutenant Ellison, 1st Foot Guards. I was sent at one time of the day, I believe about 2 o'clock, from the orchard with some light troops to drive the French tirailleurs back, who had become very annoying to the farm and were gradually gaining ground, particularly on the right flank of our position. We drove them quite out of the wood upon 3 French columns, which were posted at the bottom of the hill outside the wood, ready to move up and renew their attack on the farmhouse. 2 of these columns just beginning to move, the third unpiling arms and falling into support. We, of course, were driven back immediately. Major Lebeau, Premier de Ligne of Soy's brigade. It was unwise to risk all 3 battalions that made up my regiment, in view of the resistance Hougoumont had put up against the previous assaults. I ordered the 2nd and 3rd battalions to remain in reserve, and by a normal movement, forgetting that I was à la masse, I marched at the head of the 1st battalion to attack the farm, upon which I was repulsed with heavy losses, and those noticeably amongst the officers. I returned to the charge with the 2nd battalion, combined with the debris of the 1st, with the same result as the 1st, despite superhuman efforts. Breaking down as skirmishers the remains of these 2 battalions and sending them down to the flanks of the farm from where a murderous lead came, I turned on it with the 3rd battalion, my last resource. I fell in my turn. The ball which struck me had been aimed specifically at me.
From then on, I devoted myself to the 1st Battalion and doubled with them at Planchenoir. It was about 6 o'clock, perhaps 7. I do not know how long I remained there, but it seemed to me a long time. I called Lieutenant Jules to me, and finding Lepeg in the first houses of the village, I told him to move to the last houses of the village and to occupy them strongly. Entering, I met poor General Dusmay, who was being carried dead or dying on his horse. When the Voltiers running away, Chatrin, Commandant en Second of the Young Guard, who told me that he could do nothing. Colonel Hull, commander of the 3rd Voltiers, was not lacking men, but they were all retiring. I promised them I would stop the enemy and urged them to rally behind me. Indeed, I moved to the centre of the village, and there, seeing Lieutenant Lepage's men approaching and the Prussians that pursued them, I ordered Captain Perchot to advance with the 1st company in attack the enemy, who were coming down the road opposite the one we were on, with the bayonet. His sergeant, Cran, who was very keen, gave the order to the 1st platoon and marched with it. He executed my order, but hardly had the enemy turned his back than the men began to skirmish, and he lost control of them. The enemy sent new forces. Pachot was not able to concentrate his platoon, and he was pushed back. I advanced another. I wanted to skirmish. I led it myself, and the enemy fled. But this platoon disappeared, and with each charge I made, the same thing happened. The men of my last company shouted, "En avant!" started firing, and also disappeared. I had the church occupied by some men that I led there, and found myself again face to face with the Prussians, who fired at me from point-blank range, but missed. Then seeing what a strong resistance we put up, they launched a shower of shells into the village and attempted to turn it by the way of the lance and the woods there. I sent an officer there, I think it was Captain Agnes. In all these attacks, he took many prisoners. Our soldiers were furious and cut their throats. I rushed to them to prevent it, and as I got there, I saw them perish under my own eyes. They faced having their throats cut with the sang for it and hung onto my men. I was revolted. Overcome with fury, I took several under my protection, including an officer who prostrated himself, telling me of his French friends and those of his family. I put him behind my horse, then handed him over to my sappers, saying they would answer to me for his safety. I sent Captain Hiot to the left to occupy and defend the church. He went well ahead, and next to the wood opposite the enemy, from the rear came some men of the young guard who charged into the village. However, the combat, having gone on for a long time, had dispersed. All my men as skirmishers. I could not rally a single platoon. The enemy did not enter the village, but he deployed on all sides, and in each interval between the gardens, I saw muskets aiming at me from 40 paces. I do not know why I was not struck down 20 times. I went to and fro on Isabel, his horse. I had taken off my riding coat, and yet our men did not seem to recognise me as a general officer. Certainly, I still held the village. I came, I went, and I had the charge beaten, the rally, then the drum roll. Nothing brought together even a platoon. Finally, at the moment, I was most embarrassed, most pressed, and at the same time totally exposed. A platoon of grenadiers of the 2nd Battalion of the 2nd Regiment arrived, sent by whom I do not know. But then I was content. I stopped it and used it to rally some chasseurs. Then I had it charged with the bayonet without firing a shot. They went forward like a wall and overthrew everything they encountered. I remembered there in the middle of this hail of shells, lit up by fire. I remained there in the middle of this hail of shells, lit up by fire, that had started to burn a number of houses in a terrible continuous fusillade. The Prussians surrounded us with numerous skirmishers. I didn't care. We held like demons. I could not form up my men, but they were all hidden away and laid down murderous fire on the enemy that contained him. They were stopped despite the numbers that should have overwhelmed us, whilst I came and went continually between the entry and the exit of the village, animating and holding in place all those in the middle of the skirmishing. I encountered Colban, chef de battalion of the 1st Battalion of the 2nd Chasseurs. He appeared to me a little pale, and I noticed with regret, for perhaps he was thinking of the same with me, although I certainly felt as calm and tranquil as I had only a few times before in my life, even in the middle of these enemies that I believe bore me a particular grudge.